once again, and welcome back to our exploration of the Daedric princes. Continuing our Elder Scrolls 4 theme, we have Sheogorath up next, the Prince of Madness himself. As before, we will be exploring this lore through the chronology of the game releases, so again, his specific origins may not show up until partway through the video, rather than straight away, as you might expect. But you can see the previous video all about Mehrunes Dagon if you need any more clarity on that. Once again, this will mainly be an audio-focused experience, so sit back, relax, maybe even play some Shivering Isles content, and of course, remember to subscribe so I know you want this series to continue. Now, speaking of our previous discussion of Dagon, I realized I forgot to talk about something pretty important. I never explained what a Daedric Prince actually is. So, before we get into Sheogorath specifically, we'll be starting there. To explain the Daedric Princes, we first need a bit of a history lesson. Or at least a lesson on the generally accepted creation myth. In the beginning, there were two forces, Anu and Padme, stasis and change respectively. One way or another, these two beings spawned Anuiel and Sithis, and from there, you get the beings that would go on to become the Aedra and the Daedra, most of them anyway. The relationships between Anu, Padme, Anuiel, Sithis, and all these beings is different depending on culture and interpretation, so we won't get too deep into it, but one of these beings, Lorcan, wanted to create a new realm, Mundus. Now again, the story here can be different, but one way or another, the Aedra agreed and gave up much of their power to help create it. The Daedra wanted no part in it at all. This is where the elven names Aedra and Daedra come from. Aedra means our ancestors, and Daedra means not our ancestors. Each prince typically has their own plane of oblivion and a sphere of influence. Sheogorath's sphere, for example, being madness and creativity. Daedric princes also have no set sex, meaning that prince is a gender-neutral term here, which is why, for example, Boethia is depicted as both male and female, and why either way they are still labelled as prince. Another interesting note is that the Daedric princes are incapable of imagination and new ideas, which is why, as wacky as the Planes of Oblivion are, they're not incomprehensible to look at. Like how Molag Bal has a corrupted version of the White Gold Tower in Cold Harbor. Now in the specific case of Sheogorath, this doesn't actually seem to be true, but we'll get to that later. Now let's get started on Sheogorath himself. This time we will be starting with Daggerfall. Sheogorath has a small but important role in the main story, specifically during the quest Journey to Aetherius, in which the player is to recover the Mantella, which, without going into too much detail, is the MacGuffin that lets you finish the game by giving it to whoever gives you the ending you want. Anyway, during this mission, Sheogorath will appear and ask the player what his favourite weapon is aside from a sword, the answer being crossbow. Then, to continue, the player gets shot from a giant crossbow. That's pretty much it, but technically he did help to cause the war in the west, so that's something. Sheogorath's other contribution in Dagrafall is to give the player a quest to invite a battle mage to have tea with him. You end up killing the battle mage, but according to his worshipper, he decided that was for the best after all. The worshipper will then reward you with the Wabbajack. So before we move on to Morrowind, let's talk about the most iconic of the prince's artifacts. The Wabbajack represents Sheogorath in almost every way it can. The head of the staff is carved with faces of various emotions, and its effects are seemingly random, and can either be a benefit or a deterrent to those who use it. Rather like dealing with the Mad God himself. But let's get on to Morrowind. Morrowind, once again, doesn't give us a whole lot of Sheogorath directly, but still has a lot to offer us in regards to him. Much like Dagon, Sheogorath is one of the four corners of the House of Troubles, according to the Beck in the Tribunal, or one of the four bad Daedra in contrast to the good Daedra of Boethia, Azura, and Mephala, depending on the era and who the predominant faith belongs to. But again, despite being called the bad Daedra, Sheogorath, Mehrunes Dagon, Malikath, and Molag Bal are still revered as the testing gods, and Sheogorath, unsurprisingly, represents the test of mental strength. Now, despite being these testing gods, under the rule of the Tribunal, it was against the law to to actively worship them, a fact I completely neglected to mention when talking about Dagon, my apologies there. But Sheogorath wasn't particularly thrilled about that arrangement and decided to launch a giant boulder at Vivek City. Now, what exactly this rock bar Dao is up for debate. Some believe it to be from the void, some believe it to be a forgotten god or former follower of Magnus. There's even a tale that Sheogorath, rather than throwing it, simply convinced it to try and crash. Regardless, it was stopped by Vivek, and there it would remain until his disappearance, where it would finally crash and lead to the eruption of Red Mountain in the 5th year of the 4th era. Vivek's disappearance would also mark the end of mainstream tribunal worship, and Daedra worship would resume. Now, before we talk about the quest Sheogorath sends the player on, there is one thing I would like to mention now, before we get to Oblivion and the Shivering Isles and whatnot, and that is the voice actor. In Morrowind, he was voiced by Jeff Baker, the same guy who did the voices for the Dark Elves. Now, whilst this is definitely just a game dev thing and not a lore thing, I thought I'd mention a key difference between this version and Wes Johnson's version. Baker's Sheogorath sounds almost bored. He's very monotone despite all the strange things he says, which makes a lot of sense as a way of representing Sheogorath, who, at this time, was also often pronounced Shegorath, by the way, so that's another difference. Wes Johnson's readings, as I'm sure you know, are far more bombastic and wild, but do occasionally have a dark, serious edge to them, showing more the internal contrast of his mind. I'm not saying that either is better or worse, that's up to you, but it's at least worth noting. But back to Sheogorath himself. In Morrowind, he wanted the player to use an object known as the Fort of Horripilation to kill a bullnet. The fort is a cursed item here, draining 200 points of your magicka. Aside from Sheogorath seeming to enjoy forcing people to use it as a weapon, there's not much else to say about it. Although, according to a priest in ESO, it smells of beef, so there's that. Oh, he's also part of that Cold Harbor compact we spoke about last time. But anyway, on to Oblivion. The main game of Oblivion sees the Prince of Madness, who I feel I should also mention his a different voice actor before the Shivering Isles was introduced, though that's a little less relevant this time, give the player a rather interesting quest. You head to Border Watch and essentially torment the residents by carrying out their prophecy, a prophecy they think marks the end of the world. Sheogorath even makes the sky rain burning dogs. It's quite the spectacle. The player's reward is, once again, the Wabbajack, but of course the real reason we're in Oblivion is to discuss its DLC, the Shivering Isles. But to explore this DLC, we must first explore its antagonist. That's right, this is a Sheogorath Jyggalag double feature. How could it not be? There's no way to understand one without the other. Jyggalag is the Daedric Prince of Order and Deduction. Using these powers, it was said Jyggalag could predict any event with perfect precision. According to Jyggalag himself, he and his forces of Order once swept across Oblivion, unstoppable to such an extent that the other princes had to come together to curse Jyggalag, changing him into that which he most despised, madness. Jyggalag became Sheogorath, and this information is central to understanding the events of the Shivering Isles. But before we get on to that, let's take a quick moment to discuss the Sword of Jyggalag, so that I can bring up a couple of points. The Sword of Jyggalag is a similar creation to the weapons of his Knights of Order. It is perfectly symmetrical, perfectly balanced, you might say. But the reason I bring this sword up is mainly to address another point I didn't mention when talking about Mehrunes Dagon. I will not be covering Creation Club content in these. I just don't see it as canon. This is especially relevant for this topic due to the Saints and Seducers creation, but the Creation Club is just far too inconsistent and afterthoughty for me to consider it canon or relevant. If it has supporting content in future games that reinforce it as being canon, I will reconsider them on a case-by-case basis, but that's about it. ESO may be devices and occasionally lore-breaking, but at least it feels like these things were done on purpose rather than thought about for all the 3 seconds without considering any potential ramifications. Though, we will get to ESO later. Back to the Shivering Isles now, and let's talk about the titular isles themselves, shall we? The Shivering Isles are an island divided into two regions, Mania and Dementia. Mania represents the more whimsical side of Sheogorath, the cheese-loving crazed god who enjoys a good unpredictable game. Dementia, on the other hand, is the opposite. Remember, madness isn't all just wacky fun, it includes incredibly serious mental conditions like depression, trauma, anxiety, paranoia, and many, many more. To really bring that idea home, Dementia also has a location within it called the Hill of Suicides. It's not all cheese and Wabbajacks with Sheogorath. The capital city is known as New Sheoth, which really reinforces the idea that I keep pronouncing his name wrong, but hey, it's pronounced differently all the time in the games anyway. New Sheoth is divided up into two regions once again, this time called Bliss and Crucible. I'm sure you can guess which one is which. But the main events of the Shivering Isles center around the Grey March, an event in which the forces of order invade the Shivering Isles, and Sheogorath disappears to become Jyggalag to lead them in destroying the realm. Then the event ends, Sheogorath rebuilds, and so the cycle continues. The Grey March occurring once every vague amount of time. But during the events of the game, Sheogorath has hatched himself a plan. The player character is to mantle Sheogorath. And this is the part of the video where I have to explain mantling. The misconception with mantling is that your character has become the mad god, but the reality is more your character has been replaced by Sheogorath. Sheogorath has only changed in that he now has the character's memories and experience, but your character is gone once the mantling process is complete. Well, assuming you actually believe that the hero of Kvatch is the one who did the Shivering Isles questline. Regardless, in order to mantle Sheogorath, you require the Staff of Sheogorath, which has to be made anew as it wanes in power as Sheogorath becomes Jyggalag. Anyway, mantle the mad god you do, and once you have defeated Jyggalag, the curse is broken. The single entity these Daedric princes were is no more. Sheogorath and Jyggalag are now two separate beings, a deal that works out very nicely for both of them. Which begs the question, if Jyggalag can predict every action, and he was clearly happy with this one, did he plan his defeat himself? Sheogorath is supposed to believe that free will trumps fate, and the idea was supposed to come from him. But if Jyggalag did foresee everything, then does free will even exist? Well, I'll let you figure that one out. The only other thing to mention is an artifact known as the Staff of the Everscamp. This staff will, unsurprisingly, endlessly summon scamps to terrorize whoever possesses it. It will also slow the wielder and has the wonderful property of making you not want to throw it away. An amazing troll item. Now, let's move on to Skyrim. But wait, not so fast. Our next game is not, in fact, Skyrim, but The Elder Scrolls Legends, a card game for those who don't know, which sadly has recently shut down. This may be the only example of a mortal actually defeating Sheogorath. Adonmur wanted Sheogorath to make him forget about the death of his son. Sheogorath then manipulated the man's memories to make him believe he was trying to save his son, and got the Dunmer to complete tasks for him in service of this goal. Eventually, this Dunmer would realize that his son had been dead the entire time, and still being unaware of his original intentions, thanks to Sheogorath messing with his mind, he attempted to gain audience with Sheogorath once again by bringing him the Sword of Jyggalag. Sheogorath then used an artifact known as the Memory Wand to make the Dunmer remember everything he had forgotten. A quick side note to this story is that in the aftermath of the Shivering Isles questline, Sheogorath had to repress his memories of being Jyggalag as they caused him too much pain. The Dunmer, furious now that he knew what Sheogorath had done to him, managed to claim the Memory Wand and turned it on Sheogorath, forcing him to fulfill the Dunmer's original wish, lest he be tortured by his memories of Jyggalag. Now, on to Skyrim, where we find Sheogorath on holiday inside the mind of the long-deceased Emperor Pelagius III, as you do. You would enter here at the request of one of Sheogorath's servants to get him to go back to New Sheoth, and once you've accomplished that, you're given the Wabbajack, and that's about it. Not much to talk about with Skyrim. But now it's once again time for everyone's favourite game, ESO. Now, we'll only be talking about a couple of events from here, as the elsewhere stuff is obviously very rooted in Khajiit mythology, and as I said previously, I want to tackle all of the Khajiit mythology in one video. But our first ESO event begins slightly before ESO. In the first era, the mage Shalador would establish the island of Avea as a sanctuary for mages, but would go on to lose it to Sheogorath in order to attempt to obtain the Folium Discognitum. The Folium Discognitum is a book much like the Ogma Infinium of Hermaeus Mora, but said to contain even greater knowledge. However, the book is completely unreadable. Fast forward to the second era, and Shalador was able to convince Sheogorath to allow him to attempt to win back the island by completing trials for Sheogorath's amusement. Shalador and co. were able to reclaim the island, but Sheogorath decided to leave a bunch of his Daedric minions on there anyway. A little later on that same year, Sheogorath decided to inflict madness on the mayor of a town called Southport in Valenwood. This got so bad that its citizens began killing each other in the streets as the madness got worse. But eventually, as always, the protagonist would save the day. Nice and quick for ESO this time, but we're not done just yet. Oh, also, there's a whole thing in ESO where Sheogorath tries to get people to mantle him during every Grey March, but that doesn't line up with Oblivion at all, so we're just gonna ignore it. Next, we're going to explore some of the more interesting tales and stories of Sheogorath. But just before we get to the Accords, which are records of Sheogorath's dealings with the other Daedric princes, let's talk about a tale that could fit right at home there. For those of you who know the story of Umbra, one possible variation of events is that the witch Naenra, who was said to have made the sword for Clavicus Vile, was actually Sheogorath in disguise, which would make the wild chain of events following that his fault too. But let's get into the stories of Sheogorath proper. Unfortunately, we only currently have access to 3 of the 16 Accords of Madness, so let's go in order of what we have and start with Volume 6. Sheogorath once summoned the Prince of the Hunt, Hircine, and challenged him to a contest. Each prince was to return 3 years later with a beast and pit them against one another. Hircine would create a creature said to have no peer in his hunting grounds, a Daedroth cursed with lycanthropy. When it came time to do battle, Hircine was naturally confident. Even more so when Sheogorath revealed his fighter, a small, colourful bird. The were-Daedroth was upon the bird in seconds, but the bird hopped merrily onto the creature's snout. In a rage, the Daedroth swiped at its own head, blinding itself in its attempt to catch the bird. Hircine could do nothing but watch as his creation continued to tear itself apart. When it was done, the prince burned the remains and swore in such foul, forgotten tongues that none to this day dare to travel atop the mountain. Next, we have Volume 9. Volume 9 tells of another contest, this time with Vermina, the Daedric Prince of Nightmares. The contest was simple. Which one of them could make an artist, specifically the artist Darius Shano, more hated? Each had 10 years to do so, and up first was Vermina. Vermina spent a decade inflicting Darius with the most horrific nightmares and frightful imagery possible. The art he made from it would inspire disgust and repulsion, but also fascination, some even openly enjoying the imagery. When it came time for Sheogorath to take over, he simply did nothing. Cut off from his inspiration, Darius's work would lose its attraction and his mind would go from despair to rage. His pieces became mockeries of the heavens and gods he believed abandoned him. He would challenge them publicly and even wrote a piece mocking Tiber Septim himself for allying with the pathetic pantheon of the divines. This sparked such outrage that Darius would be executed to the tune of hundreds of cheering witnesses. Sheogorath would then claim 3 scores of Vermina's followers to be his own as his prize. Next up is Volume 12, and I'm going to read this one in its entirety because it highlights a key point regarding Sheogorath. In the days before Orsinium's founding, the spurned orc folk were subjected to ostracism and persecutions even more numerous and harsh than their progeny are accustomed to in our own age. So it was that many champions of the Orsimer travelled, enforcing what borders they could for for the proliferation of their own people. Many of these champions aren't spoken of yet today, among them the Cursed Legion, Groma the Hairless, and the noble Emik Grokera. The latter crusader would certainly have risen to legendary status throughout Tamriel had he not been subject to the attention of certain Daedric princes. Emik Grokera was the bastard son of a young maiden who was killed in childbirth. He was raised by the shaman of his tribe, the Grilkamuk, in the peaks of what we now call Nomar Heights. Late in his 15th year, Emik forged by hand an ornate suit of scaled armor, a rite of ascension among his tribe. On a blustery day, he pounded the finest rivet, and draping a heavy cloak over the bulky mantle, Emik set out from his village for the last time. Word of his exploits always returned home, whether defending merchant caravans from brigands or liberating enslaved beastfolk. News of the noble orc crusader began to grace even the lips of the Bretons, often with a tinge of fear. Less than 2 years after ascending to maturity, Grokera was making camp when a thin voice called out from the thickening night. He was surprised to hear the language of his people, spoken by a tongue that obviously did not belong to an orc. "Lord Kera," said the voice, "tales of your deeds have crossed the lips of many, and have reached my ears." Peering into the murk, Emik made out the silhouette of a cloaked figure, made wavy and ephemeral by the hazy campfire. From the voice alone, he had thought the interloper an old hag, but he now decided that he was in the presence of a man of slight and lanky build, though he could discern no further detail. "Perhaps," the wary orc began, "but I seek no glory. Who are you?" Ignoring the question, the stranger continued, "Despite that, Orsimer, glory finds you, and I bear a gift worthy of it." The visitor's cloak parted slightly, revealing nothing but faintly glinting buttons in the pale moonlight, and a bundle was withdrawn and tossed to the side of the fire between the two. Emik cautiously removed the rags in which the object was swathed, and was dazzled to discover it to be a wide, curved blade with an ornately decorated handle. The weapon had heft, and Emik realized upon brandishing it that the elaborate pommel disguised the more practical purpose of balancing the considerable weight of the blade itself. It was nothing much to look at in its present condition, thought the orc. But once the tarnish was cleaned away and a few missing jewels restored, it would indeed be a blade worthy of a champion 10 times his own worth. "Her name is Neb Crescent," spoke the thin stranger, seeing the appreciation lighting Rokera's face. "I got her for a horse and a secret in warmer climes. But in my old age, I'd be lucky to even lift such a weapon. It's only proper that I pass her on to one such as yourself. To possess her is to change your life forever." Overcoming his initial infatuation with the Ark of Honed Steel, Emik turned his attention back to the visitor. "Your words are fine, old man," Emik said, not masking his suspicion. "But I'm no fool. You traded for this blade once, and you'll trade for it again tonight. What is it that you want?" The stranger's shoulders slumped, and Emik was glad to have unveiled the true purpose of this twilight visit. He sat with him a while, eventually offering a stack of furs, warm food, and a handful of coins in exchange for the exotic weapon. By morning, the stranger was gone. In the week following Emik's encounter with the stranger, Neb Crescent had not left its scabbard. He had encountered no enemy in the woods, and his meals consisted of fowl and small game, caught with bow and arrow. The peace suited him fine, but on the 7th morning, while fog still crept between the low-hanging boughs, Emik's ears pricked up at the telltale crunch of a nearby footfall in the dense snow and forest debris. Emik's nostrils flared, but he was upwind, being able to see or smell his guest, and knowing that the breeze carried his scent in that direction. Emik's guard was up, and he cautiously drew Neb Crescent from its sheath. Emik himself was not entirely sure of all that happened next. The first moment of conscious memory in Emik Grokera's mind after drawing Neb Crescent was the image of the curved blade sweeping through the air in front of him, spattering blood over the virginal powder coating the forest floor. The second memory was a feeling of frenzied bloodlust creeping over him. But it was then that he saw for the first time his victim, an orc woman, perhaps a few years younger than himself, her body a canvas of grisly wounds, enough to kill a strong man 10 times over. Emik's disgust overwhelmed the madness that had overtaken him, and with all his will enlisted, he released Nebcrescent from his grip and let the blade set sail. With a discordant ringing, it spun through the air and was buried in a snowdrift. Emik fled the scene in shame and horror, drawing the hood of his cloak up to hide himself from the judging eyes of the rising sun. The scene where Emik Rokera had murdered one of his own kind was a macabre one. Below the neck, the body was flayed and mutilated almost beyond recognition, but the untouched face was frozen in a permanent expression of abject terror. It was here that Sheogorath performed certain rites that summoned Malikath, and the two Daedric lords held court in the presence of the disfigured corpse. "Why show me this mad one?" began Malikath, once he had recovered from his initial wordless outrage. "Do you take such pleasure in watching me grieve the murder of my children?" His guttural voice rumbled, and the patron of the Orsimer looked upon his counterpart with accusing eyes. "By birth she was yours, brother outcast," began Sheogorath, solemn in aspect and demeanor. "But she was a daughter of mine by her own habits. My mourning here is no less than your own, my outrage no less great." "I am not so sure," grumbled Malikath. "But rest assured that vengeance for this crime is mine to reap. I expect no contest from you. Stand aside." As the fearsome prince began to push past him, Lord Sheogorath spoke again. "I have no intention of standing between you and vengeance. In fact, I mean to help you. I have servants in this wilderness, and can tell you just where to find our mutual foe. I only ask that you use a weapon of my choosing. Wound the criminal with my blade, and banish him to my plane, where I can exact my own punishment. The rights of honor killing here belong to you." With that, Malikath agreed, took the wide blade from Sheogorath, and was gone. Malikath materialized in the path of the murderer, the cloaked figure obscured through a blizzard haze. Bellowing a curse so foul as to wilt the surrounding trees, the blade was drawn, and Malikath crossed the distance more quickly than a wild fox. Frothing with rage, he swung the blade in a smooth arc, which lopped the head of his foe cleanly off, then plunged the blade up to its hilt in his chest, choking off the spurts of blood into a steady, growing stain of red, bubbling beneath the scaled armor and heavy cloak. Panting from the unexpected immediacy and fury of his own kill, Malikath rested on a knee as the body before him collapsed heavily backwards, and the head landed roughly upon a broad, flat stone. The next sound broke the silence like a bolt. "I'm sorry," sputtered the voice of Emik Rokera. Malikath's eyes went wide as he looked upon the severed head, seeping blood from its wound, but somehow kept alive. Its eyes wavered about wildly, trying to focus on the aspect of Malikath before it. The once proud eyes of the champion were choked with tears of grief, pain, and confused recognition. To his horror, Malikath realized only now that the man he had killed was not only one of his Orsimer children, but very literally a son he had blessed an orc maiden with years hence. For achingly long moments the two looked upon each other, despondent and shocked. Then, silent as oiled steel, Sheogorath strode into the clearing. He hefted Emik Rokera's disembodied head and bundled it into a small grey sack. Sheogorath reclaimed Nebcrescent from the corpse and turned to walk away. Malikath began to stand, but kneeled again, knowing he had irreversibly damned his own offspring to the realm of Sheogorath, and mourned his failure as the sound of his son's hoarse pleas faded into the frozen horizon. This story is rather horrific, and it shows us a side of Sheogorath we rarely get to see. This is the kind of thing you expect from Molag Bal, a truly evil being, not the jovial, cheese-loving god we're so accustomed to. In his other stories, he does still do horrible things, but he rarely appears so malicious. Sheogorath's unpredictability makes him one of the most terrifying of all the princes. But we have time for one last story, just to lighten the mood a little. This one only has a little bit of murder in it. I'll read this one in its entirety too, because it's so short. This comes from the book The Myths of Sheogorath. In the earliest of days, in a time when the world was still raw, Sheogorath decided to walk amongst the mortals. He donned his guise of gentleman with a cane, and moved from place to place without being recognized. After 11 days and 11 nights, Sheogorath decided that life among mortals was even more boring than his otherworldly existence. What can I do to make their lives more interesting, he said to himself. And at that same moment, a young woman nearby commented wistfully to herself, "The sounds of the birds are so beautiful." Sheogorath silently agreed with her. Mortals could not make the beautiful and inspired calls of birds. Their voices were too wretched and mundane. He could not change the nature of mortals, for that was the purview of the other Daedric princes. However, he could give them tools to make beautiful sounds. Sheogorath took hold of the petulant woman and ripped her asunder. From her tendon he made lutes. From her skull and arm bones he made a drum. From her bones he made flutes. He presented these gifts to mortals, and thus music was born. This story is what I was referencing at the start of this video when I said that not being able to create new things may not apply to Sheogorath, and, of course, that his sphere encompasses creativity. Of course, this tale is indeed, as all of these tales may be, untrue. The lore regarding creation may be untrue. Elder Scrolls lore very rarely has one set correct answer, especially when it comes to forces like these. Now, of course, there are other stories, but I think going over his various sides and the relationships he had with the other Daedric princes is good enough for now. And that is it for today. Everything you need to know about Sheogorath, with a little Jyggalag thrown in for good measure. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.